Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Hello dear students, welcome to another lecture, and in today's class we are going to start with the fourth chapter of your class 10th alternative English, which is In Celebration of Being Alive. Now, as the name suggests, this is a very positive, a very optimistic story that we are going to read. The celebration of being alive. The author is telling us all that we ought to celebrate the fact that we are alive. We need to be happy about the fact that we are alive. Each one of us will have multiple problems in our lives. There would be multiple stress that we are going through at this moment. But irrespective of that, he, through this chapter, is going to tell us the reason why we have to and why we should celebrate what we have. We should be happy with what we have rather than regretting, rather than feeling bad and sorry about what we did not or what we lost. So, this chapter written by Christian Barnard. Now, Christian Barnard was a great heart surgeon from South Africa who performed the first human heart surgery, the human heart transplant. His father was a pastor in church. He was from Beaufort West, Cape Province Union of South Africa. He became a doctor in 1945. And he specialized in cardioracis surgery in America under Walt Leleny, known as the father of open heart surgery. So he'd specialized from a man who was known as the father of open heart surgery. Barnard returned to South Africa in 1958 and worked as a cardioracis surgeon. He experimented in an animal heart transplant on dogs. He performed the first human heart transplant on December 3, 1967 with his brother, Maurice Barnard, assisting him. His patient was Louis Washkansey, a 54-year-old grocer. The donor heart was from a young woman, Dennis Darwal, who was brain dead after an accident while crossing a road the previous day. The title is from Barnard's statement, "The business of living is the celebration of being alive." So what we are going to read is something that Christian Barnard, or I should say Dr. Christian Barnard, had accounted for in one of his statements, in which he tells each one of us to celebrate whatever we have, to feel happy about being alive, to feel happy about whatever we have in life. So let us read this chapter. Okay. More and more, as I near the death of my career as a heart surgeon, my thoughts have turned to the consideration of why people should suffer. Suffering seems so cruelly prevalent in the world today. Do you know that of the 125 million children born this year, 12 million are unlikely to reach the age of 1, and another 6 million will die before the age of 5. And of the rest, many will end up as mental or physical cripples. So Dr. Barnard tells us that more and more as I neared the end of my career. So obviously he passed away, as we've just read, in the year 2001. So this account was taken from one of his statements that he'd written before he could retire from his profession of being a heart surgeon. So he tells us that now that I am coming closer to the age when I will end my career as a heart surgeon, where I will get retirement as a heart surgeon, my thoughts have turned to the consideration What thing continues to bother me? There is one thing that continues to come to my mind is that why should people suffer? Why are the people feeling bad about anything? Why is there any pain in the world in the first place? Why should there be? Suffering seems so cruelly prevalent in the world today. He says that suffering, pain, this is something which is there in the world. Prevalent, it can be seen everywhere. Everyone is sad, everyone is suffering, everyone is afraid in one way or the other. Do you know that of the 125 million children born this year, he is giving us a very shocking account of, with the help of which we can actually get to know how much suffering actually there is in the world. So he tells us that out of 125 million who were born this year, 12 million will not reach the age of 1. They will die before reaching the age of 1. 6 million will die before reaching the age of 5. And the rest, whatever is the remaining population of children born, there would be so many of them who will end up being mentally or physically crippled. Crippled, their heart, crippled means their brains or their body. One of the either things will stop functioning. They will not be able to function well. My gloomy thoughts probably stem from an accident I had few years ago. One minute I was crossing the street with my wife after a lovely meal together, and the next minute a car hit me and knocked me into my wife. She was thrown into the other lane and struck by another car coming from the opposite direction. So he tells us that his gloomy thoughts, gloomy, sad, depressive, whatever depressive thoughts are there in his mind are because of his connection with the past, an accident that he had in the past a few years ago. He tells us that he was returning after having a meal with his wife, and then he was hit by a car. When he was hit by a car, he knocked into his wife. So he collapsed with his wife. He collided with his wife, because of which his wife was thrown into some other lane. And when his wife was thrown into some other lane, she was struck by another car which was coming from the opposite direction. I think just reading it and listening to it would have made you feel so scared and so fearful, because what we've read is not a very normal accident. So he says that the reason why I am so sad is mainly because of this accident that I had a few years ago. During the next few days in the hospital, I experienced not only agony and fear, but also anger. I could not understand why my wife and I had to suffer. So he tells us that obviously after this bad accident, he was in the hospital. And when he was in the hospital, he experienced a lot of agony, a lot of pain. He was very afraid. But more than that, he was angry. He could not understand the reason why he and his wife had to undergo this suffering. Why were they destined for this? At times this happens in our lives, something bad, very bad happens with you. And you just end up thinking, why me? Okay, so this was the same thing that Dr. Bernard was also thinking. He tells us that he had 11 broken ribs. So his rib cage, he had 11 broken ribs and a perforated lung. Perforated, there were multiple holes in his lung. My wife had a badly fractured shoulder. So the shoulder of his wife was fractured. Over and over, I asked myself, why should this happen to us? I had work to do. After all, there were patients waiting for me to operate on them, My wife had a young baby who needed her care. So as I just said, when something bad happens, you always ask, why me? So he said, and he was just questioning himself again and again, that why did he and his wife have to undergo that suffering? Why did that accident happen with them? He had a lot of work to do. There were patients that were there who waited him to operate on them. Then obviously he tells us that they had a little child who obviously needed the love and care of the mother. So this was something that he just did not expect to happen. My father, had he still been alive, would have said, my son, it is God's will. That is the way God tests you. Suffering ennobles you, makes you a better person. He tells us that if his father would have been alive at that moment, in that year when he underwent that that bad accident, he would surely have told him that, this is what God's will was. Okay, this is exactly what God had decided for you. He would have told him that God tests us from time to time. And whatever sufferings we have in our lives, whatever bad moments, whatever bad incidents we go through in our lives, they ennoble us, they make us stronger, they make us a better person. Ennobles us, they make us strong and more sympathetic and caring. But as a doctor, I see nothing noble in the patients thrashing around in a sweat-soaked blood, mind clouded in agony. Nor can I see any nobility in the crying of a lonely child in a ward at night. So he says that being a doctor, I do not understand if there is anything noble in a patient's thrashing around in a sweat-soaked bed. So thrashing around, if the patient undergoes some accident and after the accident the patient is completely covered with blood and we put him on the bed, I don't see there's anything good in it. Or when the mind of a person is filled with fear and pain, clouded, filled. When your brain, your mind is totally covered with a lot of fears and pains, there is nothing good in it. Nor can I see any nobility. He says, I cannot see anything good in a child who is there alone in the hospital and is crying at night. There is nobody to nurture that child. There is nobody to love that child. So he says there isn't anything good in it. I do not see anything noble in it. I had my first introduction to the suffering of children when I was a little boy. One day my father showed me a half-eaten moldy biscuit with 2 tiny tooth marks in it. And he told me about my brother who had died several years earlier. He told me about the suffering of this child who had been born with an abnormal heart. If he had been born today, probably someone could have corrected his heart problem. But in those days, there was not any sophisticated heart surgery. And this moldy biscuit was the last biscuit my brother had eaten before his death. So, Christian Bernard tells us that the first time when he got to know about the sufferings of the children, about the pains of the children, was when he was a little boy. He narrates to us a story when one day his father showed him a small half-eaten moldy biscuit. Moldy, something which becomes very old, gets this green colored mold or fungus on it. So it was a moldy biscuit and it had 2 tooth marks on that biscuit. His father told him that he had a younger brother who had died several years ago. His younger brother was born with an abnormal heart, and this biscuit was the last biscuit that he had eaten before his death. So it was then when the author realized that if his brother would have been born in the current scenario, in the current generation, maybe his heart problem would have been corrected. But since at that time there were no sophisticated, no good modern heart surgeries and equipments available, so obviously that child could not have been saved. As a doctor, I have always found the suffering of children particularly heartbreaking, especially because of their total trust in doctors and nurses. They believe you are going to help them. If you can't, they accept their fate. They go through mutilating surgery and afterwards they do not complain. He tells us that as a doctor, he finds the sufferings of the children very heartbreaking. Okay, obviously being a doctor, there are different kinds of patients that he has to address to, of different age groups. But he specifically mentions about the sufferings of the children. He specifically tells us about these children who obviously suffer a lot. Why? Because according to him, these children trust in their doctors and in the nurses a lot. So they have blind trust in the doctors and nurses. He says that if you treat them, nothing better than that. But if somehow you are not able to treat them, if somehow their condition does not get better, these kids have such a blind faith on you that they will not react. They will just accept the fact that they are not going to get better and they will be okay with it. He says that these children, they go through mutilating surgeries which just totally leaves them disfigured. One or the other part of their body is totally in a bad shape. But despite these surgeries, they never complain. Why? Because they have faith in the doctors and nurses. One morning, several years ago, I witnessed what I call the Grand Prix of Cape Town's Red Cross Children's Hospital. It opened my eyes to the fact that I was missing something in all my thinking about suffering, something basic that was full of solace for me. So he then tells us that one morning, several years ago, he went to the Red Cross Children's Hospital. And there he saw a race, a kind of a race that was taking place, and he compares that race to the Grand Prix. We all have heard this is a car race, a very popular, a very famous name. So he compares this to the Grand Prix and he says that it was on that day when my eyes opened and I understood that I was missing something about thinking, that about suffering, that there was something very, very important for me to understand about the suffering part that we undergo in our lives. This was so important and this was so essential that actually brought solace for him. Solace, he actually got very peaceful when he saw it and when he experienced it. Now, what was it? How do you think could, something have made him feel that suffering is good? Do you think this is something that anybody on a normal account feel? I don't think so. But our author did. What was so special about that Red Cross Hospital's race? Let us read. So what happened there that morning was that a nurse had left a breakfast trolley unattended. And very soon this breakfast trolley was commandeered by an intrepid crew of 2. A driver and a mechanic. The mechanic provided motor power by galloping along behind the trolley with his head down, while the driver, seated on the lower deck, held on with one hand and steered. by scraping his foot on the floor. The choice of roles was easy because the mechanic was totally blind and the driver had only one arm. So, he says that what happened one day, one morning the nurse had left a breakfast trolley unattended. We all once or the other have been to the hospital for both good or bad reasons, and we see that the patients there are obviously served food. So there was a nurse who had left the breakfast trolley. So the trolley on which the breakfast is served, it was left unattended. There was nobody around to take care of it. And very soon what happened was that breakfast trolley was commandeered by an intrepid crew of 2. Commandeered means controlled. Intrepid means fearless. So there were 2 very fearless boys who took control of that trolley. One of them became a driver and the other became a mechanic. The mechanic provided motor power by galloping along behind the trolley with his head down. So what was the mechanic doing? The mechanic was galloping, running. So he was running behind the trolley. His head was down and he was running behind the trolley. He was pushing the trolley. He was running like a horse. And the driver, he was seated in the trolley on the lower deck. There are different decks. There are different, shelves of that trolley also. So in the lower shelf, the driver was sitting, held on with one hand and steered by scraping his foot on the floor. So with one hand he held on to the trolley and with the help of his foot he was scraping the floor. So he was pushing the trolley further with the help of his foot. Obviously since he was sitting, so he could only apply force onto that trolley with the help of his feet that he was scraping on the floor. Dr. Bernard tells us that this choice of roles was very easy. Who had to sit and who had to push was quite easy. Why? Because the mechanic was totally blind. The mechanic was blind, so he could just hold on to that trolley. And the driver had just one arm. So since he had one arm, with one arm he was holding himself, and with the other arm he was pushing the trolley ahead. So there wasn't much difference that they could have done with respect to the changing roles. They put on quite a show that day. Judging by the laughter and shouts of encouragement from the rest of the patients, it was much better entertainment than anything anyone puts on at the Indianapolis 500 car race. There was a grand finale of scattered plates and silverware before the nurses and ward sister caught up with them, scolded them and put them back to bed. So obviously they had put up quite a show. What they did was viewed and was liked and enjoyed by each one of them, each of the patient who was there at the hospital that day. Everyone was laughing, everyone was encouraging them, and Dr. Bernard says that what they were doing was even more entertaining than the Indianapolis 500 car race. So this again is a very famous car race. So he said that what they were doing at that time was far, far more entertaining and enjoyable than that Indiana 500 car race. And the grand finale came. Grand finale, what do we mean by grand finale? The final moment of something. So the final moment came when, because of them roaming and running with that trolley, all the plates and all the crockery, silverware refers to the crockery. So everything was scattered, was spread here and there. Finally, the nurses and the ward sister, they had come. They got hold of the two boys, scolded both of them, and put them back to bed. So this is what those notorious two boys had done one early morning at the Red Cross hospital. Now the doctor tells us something about these two boys. He says that the mechanic was all of 11 years old. So the mechanic, the boy who was holding the trolley, he was 11 years of age. One night when his mother and father were drunk, his mother threw a lantern at his father, missed, and the lantern broke over the child's head and shoulders. He suffered severe third-degree burns on the upper part of his body and lost both his eyes. At the time of the Grand Prix, he was a walking horror, with a disfigured face and a long flap of skin hanging from the side of his neck to his body. As the wound healed around the neck, his jaw became gripped in a mass of fibrous tissue. The only way this little boy could open his mouth was to raise his head. When I stopped by to see him after the race, he said, "You know, we won," and he was laughing. So he tells us about the horrifying past of these two boys who actually made everyone at the hospital laugh. He tells us that the mechanic, so the boy who was behind the trolley, was 7 years old. One night when his parents were drunk, his mother threw a lantern. We all know what is a lantern, which burns. So the mother threw lantern at the father because they were fighting, but that lantern missed hitting the father, and rather the lantern fell on the child's head and shoulders. The lantern, since it was burning, it caused severe third-degree burns on the upper part of his body. So the upper part of the child's body was burnt and he lost both his eyes. At that time, he says, at the time of the Grand Prix, that is what the two boys were doing in the hospital at that time with the trolley, he was a walking horror. Walking horror means that boy was actually very scary to look at. Anyone who would have looked at that boy would have surely got scared and afraid. Why? Because his face was disfigured. He did not have a very good looking face. It was all disfigured. It was not in a proper shape. There was a long flap of skin hanging from the side of his neck to his body. So one side of the neck, skin was flapping down. It fell down. There was skin which was hanging on one side of his from his neck. As the wound healed around the neck, slowly, when the wound, the injury that he had around his neck, when that got better, what happened? That hanging skin got better. It obviously got a little better, but the area around his jaw, we all understand what is a jaw. So the area around his jaw had become gripped in a mass of fibrous tissue. So his area around the jaw had got changed into very thick tissue, very heavy skin was there around his jaws. And the only way in which he could open his mouth was to raise his head. Since there was so much weight beneath his jaw, he could only open his mouth if he raised his head. So it was very mechanical. He would raise his head and his mouth was automatically open. When I stopped by to see him after the race, so doctor tells us that when this race was over and when he stopped to meet this boy, the boy started laughing and he told him that, you know, we won what we were doing. Then the author tells us about the driver of the trolley, whose one hand, he did not have a hand, as I told you. The trolley's driver I know better. A few years earlier, I had successfully closed a hole in his heart. He had returned to the hospital because he had a malignant tumor of the bone. A few days before the race, his shoulder and arm were amputated. There was a slight hope of recovering. After the Grand Prix, he proudly informed me that the race was a success. The only problem was that the trolley's wheels were not properly oiled, but he was a good driver and he had full confidence in the mechanic. So the author tells us about the driver because he says that I know him very well. How did the author know him well? Because a few years earlier, this child had come to Dr. Christian Bernard with a hole in the heart. And Dr. Bernard had closed that hole in his heart. Now, the reason why he came back to the hospital after that heart surgery was because of a tumor of the bone. Malignant, we all know, something which causes cancer. So, there was a tumor, there was a cancerous tumor in his bones. And before this race, just a few days before this race, his shoulder and his arm were amputated. They were cut. In order to prevent cancer from spreading in the whole body, obviously you have to just, disconnect that body part from your body. That is the only way. So his shoulder and his arm were cut. The hope for him to recover, to get okay from cancer was very less. There were very less chances of him being okay, of him recovering from the cancer. But despite that, after that race that they had, he, with a lot of pride, with a lot of happiness, told the author that it was a successful race. The only complaint that he had was that the oils of the trolley, the wheels of the trolley were not properly oiled, and had that been better, they would have enjoyed more. But he was happy to announce that no problem about the oil, about the wheels. I know I am a good driver, and my mechanic, the one who was holding the trolley, I have full faith on him. Suddenly, I realized that these two children had given me a profound lesson in getting on with the business of living. Because the business of living is joy in the real sense of the word. Not just something for pleasure, amusement, recreation. The business of living is the celebration of being alive. So it was after his meeting with these two boys, did the author realize that there is a better way of looking at the world. He says that these two children gave him a profound lesson, a very deep meaning lesson in his life, and that is to continue to live. He taught them that the business of living is joy in the real sense of the word. What you have right now, you need to appreciate that. You need to acknowledge that rather than feeling bad about something that you could have had, rather than feeling bad about someone you lost. So what you have right now, cherish that, feel happy about it, spend the best moments with that thing. Not just something for pleasure. So he realized that every time we cannot keep on making ourselves happy, looking for things that will make us feel happy, will keep us entertained. The business of living is the celebration of being alive. We have to be happy and proud of the fact that we are alive, that we have this life to enjoy, that there are so many things that we can do with whatever little resources that we have in our lives. I had been looking at suffering from the wrong end. You don't become a better person because you are suffering, but you become a better person because you have experienced suffering. We can't appreciate the light if we have not known darkness. Nor can we appreciate warmth if we have never suffered cold. These children showed me that it's not what you have lost that's important. What is important is what you have left. So, the author tells us that the problem is that he was looking at the suffering from the wrong end. That he was looking at the problems from a different angle altogether. He says that it was then that I realized that you do not become a better person because you are suffering. If you are suffering, you have a lot of pain in your heart, does not mean you are a good person. You become a better person because you have experienced that. Once we ourselves become, when we ourselves suffer through some problem, we become more understanding and empathetic. Okay, anybody going through the similar problem would be looked at by us with a lot of love and affection. So he says that we cannot appreciate life until we have known darkness, unless and until you've seen the worst days of your life. You cannot appreciate, you cannot be thankful for the best ones in your life. Nor can we appreciate warmth if we have never suffered cold. Unless and until we've seen how good, if we haven't experienced the worst days of our lives, the saddest days of our lives, we cannot acknowledge the good ones. So he tells us that it was because of those two children that he understood that it is not what you have lost that is important. What has left you, that cannot return. What is important is what you have left. What you have right now is what you need to value the most. What you need to acknowledge and appreciate in your life is what you currently are possessed with, what you currently have been given by God. So with this, my dear students, we come to the end of a very beautiful chapter written by Dr. Christian Barnard. I am going to pause here, and in my next video, I am going to give you a summary of the chapter, and we shall discuss the back exercises of this chapter as well. So I'll see you all now in my next lecture. Thank you.